Greetings, everyone. My name is Father Joe Matern, and I am the founder of this Casa Esther Catholic Worker House in Amro, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us for this Lenten series on doing gospel justice. It will lead us into Holy Week in April, and the title of this particular series is Blessed Are the Peacemakers, which is a Lenten exploration of gospel, nonviolence, and why it matters. We thank you for joining us, as well as thanking our co-sponsors. We send you our Lenten blessings. Enjoy the series.
I'm Dave Mueller from the Casa Esther Catholic Worker Community in Amro, Wisconsin. And tonight our presentation is titled Nonviolence in Laudato Si. Laudato Si is Pope Francis's encyclical letter, otherwise known as Care for Our Common Home. It was first published in 2015, and I think it's safe to say it has grown in its influence and impact over the past few years. I'd like to announce one change. Christina Leono, our featured speaker for tonight, is not able to join us due to unforeseen circumstances, but she graciously arranged for a colleague of hers at the Laudato Si movement to speak to us tonight. So we're happy to have Dr. Erin Lothes, who will be our presenter, and Meg Olson, our moderator, will tell you a little bit more about her in a few minutes. Our Lenten series could not have been possible without our wonderful co-sponsors. Besides our 5 co-sponsoring schools, we have 2 important organizations as co-sponsors: Pax Christi USA and Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Tonight's moderator, Meg Olson, serves as the Grassroots Mobilization Director at the Network Lobby. And I've asked her to take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice before she introduces our speaker. Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And I recommend to everyone to consider getting involved with this vital organization. And so now I'm happy to turn it over to Meg Olson. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So good to be with you tonight, and excited to hear what Erin Lothes has to say in a few minutes. But I'm so glad that we're very glad to sponsor this Lenten series. And I just want to share a little bit about Network. So I know some of you on here are very familiar, but for those of you who aren't, so just give me a moment. All right, so as David said, we were founded 50 years ago in April by 47 Catholic sisters here in Washington, D.C. And we are a federal social justice lobby. We say that we educate, organize, and lobby for economic, social transformation, or economic and racial justice. We believe that people are more valuable than profits. We believe that everyone, the 100%, needs to have everything to live in dignity, and that we are all interconnected. We are rooted in Catholic social justice and the progressive spirit of Vatican II, but we are open to all who share our passion. We, of course, value women's leadership. We accept and appreciate people from all religious backgrounds as well as secular backgrounds. We are welcoming and affirming of members of the LGBTQ community, and we are engaging on becoming a multicultural, anti-racist organization. Our current public policy agenda is one of domestic federal issues that are rooted in economic and racial justice. And it's called our Build a New Agenda, a justice agenda for all of us. And our entire policy platform is built upon what we call our 4 cornerstones: dismantling systemic racism, cultivating an inclusive community, rooting our economy in solidarity, and ultimately transforming our politics. We know, of course, as Pope Francis tells us, that we have deep divisions in our nation and in our world, and yet we are one single community and we have to root ourselves in hope, and we must build in you. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Erin Lothes. So Erin Lothes is the Senior Program Manager at the Laudato Si Animators Program. Erin is an ecological theologian who holds a BA in English from Princeton University, an MA in theology from Boston College, and a PhD in theology from Fordham University. She is currently on faculty at St. Elizabeth University and served as an Earth Institute Fellow at Columbia University. Erin is the author of 2 books, Inspiring Sustainability, Planting Seeds for Action, and The Paradox of Christian Sacrifice, The Loss of Self, The Gift of Self. She is also the author of several articles on energy ethics and faith-based environmentalism. A longtime activist within the Catholic and interfaith environmental and divestment movement, Erin lives in New York with her husband and 2 sons. Before I pass it over to Erin, let us take a moment to ground ourselves in prayer. Tonight, our prayer will come from Laudato Si itself and Pope Francis. A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Erin Lothes.
Thank you so much, Meg, for that warm welcome. Thanks to you and David for convening this wonderful series of conversations. I'm so honored to be with you, and I'm very privileged to step into the feet of Christina Liano, who's unable to be with us tonight. I hope that what I have to share is of interest to you all as we ponder Laudato Si and nonviolence in this time where the very question of nonviolence has become real to us as it hasn't for many, many years. This is a Lenten series, yet Lent barely began when the world exploded into violence with the invasion of Ukraine, an invasion which shows in very pointed ways the interconnection of all things in ways that precisely connect to the encyclical Laudato Si. Laudato Si is Pope Francis's masterful critique of the forms of production and consumption that govern our world today, which have disastrous consequences for our planet and our peoples. We see in the fossil fuel regime the sources of climate change, the source of the climate impacts, which so devastate the poor. And we see in fossil fuels instruments of war, which are literally funding violence and destruction. So how can we unpack all of this? How do we look upon it as Christians, as Catholics, as people of hope, whatever our tradition, and what can we do about it? These are some of the themes I would like to unpack today in our brief time together. So there's so much more about Laudato Si than I can possibly touch upon. So I wish to speak to its messages of peace, its critique of the system of fossil fuels, and the hopes for transformation. So what is Laudato Si? As David mentioned, it is Pope Francis's encyclical published in 2015, the first one devoted to ecology, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Previous popes have written about the environment. Previous bishops' conferences have made statements, but this is the first comprehensive, totally dedicated to the problem of the environment and the crisis of biodiversity and climate change. It is, of course, inspired by St. Francis, who inspires Pope Francis, and it puts across the fundamental message that everything is interconnected. Within that, it is not simply an ecological or political critique. By no means, it is an invitation to hear the gospel of creation and heed the call to interior peace as a living practice. Pope Francis writes, I believe that St. Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. And we have this beautiful image of St. Francis with the wolf whom he befriended and lived with peacefully in the town of Gubbio. He writes, Laudato si, mi signore, alluding to the beautiful canticle of creation. Praise be to you, my Lord. This is the opening text of the encyclical. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. He teaches this new concept of an integral ecology, our connection in society, through our biology, through our chemistry, through our means of sharing culture, through social media. All of our systems in this globalized world are interconnected, and our love for our neighbor is connected to our being with other creatures, all the creatures of God's planet. He writes, a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. It is clearly inconsistent to combat trafficking in endangered species while remaining completely indifferent to human trafficking, unconcerned about the poor, or undertaking to destroy another human being deemed unwanted. So Pope Francis writes, we have one heart, and that one heart reaches out to others in all of their dimensions as full persons in their social, economic, cultural, and personal identities. That is the meaning of an integral ecology. So in his critique of what he calls one complex crisis, ecological and social, we don't have two crises, a social and economic crisis, and on the other hand, a climate change crisis. It is one integrated crisis. And he looks at our patterns of global development and observes that we live in an economy that kills. This can be plainly seen by research shown that lifespans, in fact, are different for the rich and the poor, an economy that kills. And in face of this horror, all too often there is indifference. So Pope Francis calls out the globalization of indifference. He criticizes an obsession with maximizing profit, not legitimate business, not necessary employment, but an obsession with maximizing profit with no concern for any other values. He has an especial critique of the technocratic paradigm, which refers to the power of technology to dominate everything, regardless of an assessment of whether that technology is good or bad, or actually leading to better lives. Or if we ignore the pollution or emissions that that technology may create. He criticizes practical relativism, in which the needs of others don't matter against my individual convenience. And he also speaks about cultural relativism, where principles and values fall to the wayside as societies follow a heedless pursuit of profit, production, exploiting the earth as they go. So everything is interconnected in his teaching, and the fundamental message is that we have 3 levels of relationship with God, our neighbor, and the earth, and that all of these relationships are meant to lead to the common good. The common good being the sum of those conditions of social life that affect all individuals and groups and allow them to reach their own fulfillment. So everyone should be given what they need to reach their own fulfillment, the dignity that Meg spoke of, for which network works. However, what we see all too often are ruptured relationships between ourselves and God, between ourselves and our neighbor, and certainly between ourselves and creation. The Amazon has been called the lungs of the world, but we can see how it is burning and failing to provide the protection that it's meant to, as we fail to protect it. As a result, there is massive inequality in the crisis of climate change. The map at the top shows countries enlarged in proportion to the emissions they have emitted historically. So the United States and Europe are distorted, enlarged, because they have historically emitted the most greenhouse gases. The lower map shows where the impacts of climate change are felt. And you can see that it is Africa and India that experience the greatest impacts of droughts, floods, malaria, and other changes of disease, famine, etc. Whereas the global north is not experiencing those impacts in as devastating a way. This is the global inequality of climate change, of environmental racism. And against this, he levies a theological protest. The rich and poor have equal dignity. The spirit of life dwells in every living creature, and their rights must be guaranteed. Pope Francis writes, creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things, for you love all things that exist. So a response to this crisis must begin in the heart, because it is primarily a spiritual crisis. It emerges from our lack of love for our neighbor. And so we must cultivate the interior peace that enables us to have true compassion for the other. Pope Francis writes, no one can cultivate a sober and satisfying life without being at peace with him or herself. An adequate understanding of spirituality consists in filling out what we mean by peace, which is much more than the absence of war. This is so important. There is a fullness, there is a vitality, there is a dimensionality to peace. And inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good. Because lived out authentically, it is reflected in a balanced lifestyle, together with a capacity for wonder, the wonder at the beauty of the earth, our reverence and awe for the greatness of God's creation, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. So here we see how interior peace begins within and stems from the contemplation of nature, through which we see the loving hand of God, the Creator. Peace and justice go together. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes, which cannot be separated. And this is played out in our daily lives. An integral ecology is also made up of simple daily gestures, which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. So if we perceive the interconnection of all things, we can see also how in our daily choices, our consumption, our travel, our commuting, we are having an impact on all of those who are part of this global network of production. We can see how by our lives, we are participating in the structures and the experiences in the lives of others. Conversely, this is how the ruptures in our relationships play out into the disaster of climate change. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. So I wish to focus for the next few moments on the case study of the Nigerian oil crisis. There has been a disastrous relationship between the oil companies of the global north and the people of Nigeria for decades. It is one of the most violent and exploitative relationships in the story of fossil fuels. And here we can see how the violence of fossil fuels plays out in a country. So the Nigerian Civil War involved battles over control over the lucrative oil production in the Niger Delta. And the representatives of the global north oil companies, primarily Royal Dutch Shell, were engaged in corrupt, bribing relationships with Nigerian government officials who allowed them to extract the oil that flowed in Nigeria. This led to ongoing crises, constant oil spills, constant waste, destruction of farmland and fisheries. All the while, there was no energy provided to the Nigerian people. Within the nation, energy poverty persisted at a shocking level. 3 billion persons in the world lack adequate energy. The vast majority of Nigerians, although their country was supplying oil to the global north, did not have any connection to the electricity grid, or perhaps a few hours of access every day. This is because the companies decided it was too expensive to construct the proper infrastructure to capture some of that oil for the use of the local population. Same with the gas. They would instead flare, that is, burn and waste tons and tons of gas rather than capture it through the appropriate infrastructure. So the energy poverty of the people persisted while the oil flows contaminated their lands, making it impossible to continue their traditional livelihoods of farming and fishing. Naturally, there were heroic protests to this hideous violence and exploitation. Ken Saro-Wiwa, pictured here, was a leader of the protests, and he was in fact hanged along with 8 of his companions. So the violence that we see goes beyond the destruction to the planet. It plays out in targeting ecological martyrs, which are victims around the world, to the tune of almost 300 ecological martyrs every year are targeted by massive corporations. This pattern of violence depends, it looks different depending on who you are. To the oil and gas companies, the battles that take place in this land are the work of vandals. To someone from the Catholic hierarchy, John Cardinal Onaiyekan, he sees this as a need to hold oil companies accountable. What I am thinking about, if I may stay on this case study for a moment, is thinking about fossil fuels themselves as instruments of war. What happens if we use this analogy of instruments of war to describe fossil fuels? I think several things happen. It allows us to interpret the use of fossil fuels according to a wartime image and more fully count the cost. It allows us to assess what would be called collateral damage, so that fossil fuel use involves not just the production of energy, but we must fully count the cost, the full collateral damage, the emissions and the impacts on climate change, the intensification of climate change impacts worldwide, the pollution to local persons who experience the oil spills, the damage to an economy that isn't able to diversify and develop a broader range of industries, the loss of the original homelands. So if we think of fossil fuels as instruments of war, I believe it challenges us to look at the full cost of what fossil fuels are doing. Now, there's a dimension of fossil fuel use that has been essential. Energy use is necessary for life. But what we're finding is that it's energy we need, not fossil fuels per se. And if the energy can be gained through other methods, through clean, healthy, life-giving methods, we can move away from fossil fuels, which are instruments of war against the earth and against the people. Another benefit of this interpretive framework is allowing us to distinguish between luxury emissions, which benefit those in the global north who have access to far more energy than perhaps they need, and certainly far more than is typical for the global average, and livelihood emissions. So we have luxury emissions on the one hand and livelihood emissions on the other. All persons need a certain amount of livelihood emissions to sustain cooking, light, heat, transport, access to the market, access to healthcare, access to participating in industry. But there is the excess represented by luxury emissions, which we need to critique and which Pope Francis is calling us to critique in an invitation to lives of greater simplicity and in a transformation of our energy system.
Людська гуманітарна катастрофа розгортається на наших очах, але можна завдати такого непоправного удару по Божому створінню, якого потім десятиліттями, століттями не можна буде поправити.
So as you all know, the classic Catholic tradition of just war theory is being challenged, is being invited to a transformation into a new paradigm of just peacemaking. We are being invited to radically revisit the gospel message of nonviolence and peace. So I propose that with this understanding of fossil fuels as instruments of war, we see regime change as the shift to renewable energy systems. That peacemaking means transferring to the pacifism of renewable energy, to clean, sustainable energy. And this is a process of disarmament that we are entering into out of love of the earth, out of love of our neighbors and future generations to create a sustainable planet. How will we do this? And what is the urgency of it? Well, this graph shows how much carbon on the y-axis here. You see gigatons of carbon dioxide remaining in what's called a carbon budget. A carbon budget is the amount of carbon we can yet emit and hit or stay below a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature increase. So all the way under this dark blue line is the amount of carbon we can still emit. Under this light blue line, we can emit more, but then we're going to have a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius. The problem is there is so much more potential oil and gas in global reserves, and more is being discovered all the time. That's this purple line going up and up. That is all the potential carbon dioxide in global oil and gas reserves. So if you take the point where they meet, and this is, mind you, a 50% chance of keeping to a 1.5 degree temperature increase, and bring it down, assuming emissions remain constant, this budget runs out, believe it or not, in 2025. So we will need to cease emitting in 2025 if we emit at the same rates for the next 3 years to have a 50% chance of meeting the 1.5 temperature increase. We are already at about 1.1 degrees temperature increase, and you see the climate impacts that it creates. Now, to this point of energy justice and the need for countries like Nigeria to be able to develop, to have access to the energy they need to grow as a nation, to develop their markets and their industry, to be relieved of energy poverty, there's another way of looking at this graph. And that is to separate out the potential carbon dioxide that's only in developing country reserves. That's this bottom green line. This amount could be burnt, allowing the developing countries first dibs on burning carbon dioxide, out of justice, allowing those countries to burn their gas and oil and still maintain the target. So that's another way of dividing it up that respects the incredible injustice that's happened with the nations of the global north doing the vast majority of the historical missions. So where is the hope in this? It's certainly in the courage of Greta and the thousands of young people who have said there's no planet B and insisted on change. And all of us from the older generations need to stand behind them. This is a picture from the first climate march in 2014. And here you see the Catholic climate movement of Metro New York gathering. I'm proud to say I'm back there somewhere behind all these flowers. But that was an incredible gathering of 400,000 people who came together in New York City and let the world know that society demanded change. However, we haven't seen change fast enough. We need to continue these transformations in ways large and small. Here's one of my favorite examples of small. These are the Solar Sisters, and they sell solar lamps and solar stoves and help each other begin their own entrepreneurial industries, micro industries, selling these solar lamps, which prevent people from burning either wood from cutting down trees, which creates smoke, which creates incredible unhealthy systems, or fossil fuels. And this is a process of transforming our actual options towards healthy ones. We all need to work for these changes. The Pontifical Academy of Justice and Peace has published a book called Energy, Justice, and Peace. And I think we all need to ponder the fact that the Vatican has published a book called Energy, Justice, and Peace. Everything is connected. And the message of Pope Francis is that countering structural harm through our participation in the economy, through our care for the planet, and through our actions and decisions, including our energy decisions, is neither optional nor secondary, even when the impacts seem indirect. Maybe it seems indirect that my commute is an hour both ways, but it's having an impact. What can we do on the large scale? We can examine how our money is funding fossil fuel projects. We can examine our investments and ponder and take action to divest. So without investments, fossil fuel pipelines cannot go forward. Without investments, renewable energy projects cannot be funded. So it's a very simple, it's a complicated global transition, but it's a simple idea. We have to stop putting our money into fossil fuels, and we have to start putting it into renewable energies. We have to stop funding the instruments of war against the earth. We have to press for environmental criteria in our institutional investments. We have to demand that our endowments, our retirement plans, our banks are investing according to environmental criteria. We need to provide that funding to wind and solar and to other renewable technologies. And we have to understand that this is a sophisticated method of investing with many experienced wealth advisors and investment advisors who know how to do it. You're not going out on a limb. And I love this cartoon. The people gathered around a fire in a cave. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So as I ponder divestment, I see it as a sacramental action. A sacrament makes God's love visible. And we participate in sharing God's love when we make the love of our neighbor visible through empowering renewable energy purchases, and when we take away the power of fossil fuel structures. Is it risky and ineffective? No. Divestment and reinvestment enables a pragmatic funding of new energy. Is it symbolic? Yes, but not in an empty, just symbolic way. It is an actual symbol of discipleship and commitment. So as I look on it, divestment is a sacramental, real symbol of love of neighbor that makes renewable energy a reality and carries us along the process of disarmament, disarming fossil fuels, which are the instruments of war against the planet and her people and all the families of creation. If you wish to learn more, I invite you to join a webinar hosted by the Laudato Si movement on May 25th at 9 a.m. entitled Fossil Fuels, the Climate Crisis and War, Jeff Sachs and a Call to Action Against EACOP, which is the East African pipeline that is being proposed by the French energy company Total and would be a disaster if it were funded. And Jeff Sachs is a leading economist and advisor to the United Nations who will be joining us to talk about fossil fuels, the climate crisis and war. So those are some actions that we can take at multiple scales. The small scale of personal lifestyle change, the large scale of systemic change through advocating for divestment and new economic structures, but it is all rooted in one's interior disposition, in one's ecological conversion. And this is at the heart of Laudato Si. It's an invitation to hear the gospel of creation and to respond through an ecological conversion, which is both a personal transformation and a community conversion, as Laudato Si writes. It's a journey that we take together. In the Laudato Si movement, one way we do this is through Laudato Si circles, small groups that gather for prayer and action. And we aim to empower everyone because everyone's talents and involvement are needed to redress the damage caused by human abuse of God's creation. Your talents and involvement are needed. And it's a grace that you are here on this call tonight and that you've participated in all of these evenings of reflection on how we can build peace in our world. So I would like to close with a short reflection. The ecological examine, which is one way we bring Laudato Si to life as a contemplative self-examination of our relationship with the living world. And following the Ignatian method, it has the 5 steps of the examine. So I invite you to pause for a moment of gratitude. We give thanks to God for creation and for being wonderfully made. Where did you feel God's presence in creation today? We ask for awareness, the grace to see creation as God does in all its splendor and suffering. Do you see the beauty of creation and hear the cries of the earth and the poor? Understanding. We ask for the grace to see how our life choices impact creation and the poor and vulnerable. What challenges or joys do you experience as you recall your care for creation? How can you turn away from a throwaway culture and instead stand in solidarity with creation and the poor? Conversion. We all together ask for the grace of conversion towards ecological justice and reconciliation. And we examine our lives and ask, where have I fallen short in caring for creation and my brothers and sisters? How can we ask for a conversion of heart? And finally, reconciliation. We ask for the grace to reconcile our relationships with God, creation, and humanity, and stand in solidarity through my actions. In this final stage, we look toward tomorrow and ask, how can you repair your relationship with creation and make choices consistent with your desire for reconciliation with creation? We acknowledge the ways in which we personally have chosen convenience, selfishness, and greed over ecological and social justice. We also acknowledge the ways structures, patterns, and cultures of sin impact our life, the lives of people on the margins and the earth. Through our recognition of where we have fallen short in caring for creation and our brothers and sisters, and through God's mercy, we pray for a conversion of heart to amend our ways. We seek through our prayer and actions to reconcile ourselves with God, creation, and humanity. And I invite you to say Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. I'm just so struck by that, what you were saying about divestment being an act of discipleship, and just walking us through so many of the horrors of war that at the root are is that greed for fossil fuels and the extraction industry and things like that. We do have a few questions from our audience, and I invite everyone to continue submitting questions into the chat. I'm sorry, I realize, are the college students leaving now, or do they stay with us? David, or?
They stay for now.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. Okay, so we have a few questions. Could you tell us, Erin, what led you to become an ecological theologian?
Well, I have always found God's presence in nature. I love the forests. I'm in the virtual forest here. I feel peaceful in the forest. I know that God is with me in the forest. So I experienced that. And at a certain point when I first moved to New York, I had been raised with concern for social justice as part of my Catholic upbringing and concern for the poor. And I was so moved by what the church does globally for people on the margins. But it was about 1997 when I moved to New York, and 1998 was one of the hottest years on record at that time. And it was really hot in New York. And I was starting to pick up on global warming as a thing. Now, a lot of people were already onto it. I was a little late to the game, but I started to put the pieces together and realize under these conditions of heat, of drought, of storms, the poor that we try to take care of in our church are going to suffer all the more. The hungry will be all the more hungry. The homeless will be all the more bereft of comfort.
The refugees, yeah.
The migrants, exactly. And then I realized also people will lose their beautiful spiritual spaces to go meet God. And it all started to click for me. And I realized this is terrible. Everybody has to address this problem because it affects every other problem.
Thank you. Yes, as we keep hearing tonight, right? Everything is interconnected. So absolutely. So I have a few questions here that are kind of all related, and even with my own curiosity coming from a federal lobby, obviously there's a lot of different ways that we, if we want, as taking action in this country can start, can engage in climate justice work. And I guess, right, there's this tension between, corporate campaigns versus like congressional action. And there's these questions about deplatforming billionaire companies who are lobbying for fossil fuels. Do we put our energy on them? Do we go straight to Capitol Hill? What would you suggest?
Boy, as they say, there's no silver bullet, there is silver buckshot. We need everything. The connection of fossil fuel money to our Congress people is demonic. It is demonic, and it is holding back the fate of the earth. Clarity and exposure on those connections is desperately needed. So we know why people are voting the reason they are voting. They are doing so to protect their self-interest. And those connections between our Congress people and fossil fuel money must be exposed. On a more positive note, we need to encourage people about the solutions that exist, the solutions that are so much better for their health than the current ways we power our world, and excite people about accelerating the transition on wind and solar. Texas is the leading producer of wind energy in this country. We have enormous capacity to build bridges with people on all sides of the aisle. We are going to see an enormous transition to electric vehicles. I think within 5 years, so many electric vehicles. They're expensive now. That's going to change. We need to support the infrastructure that will make it happen. So we need the investments, we need the climate bills, and we need to share our technology with countries around the world that can't afford it, so they don't take the cheap option of burning coal. We have to share with them our technologies that we develop that are cleaner and healthier.
Thank you. I am going to invite our college students to log off and go into their small group now. Noelle, are there questions for this group? Okay. So these are the 4 questions for the students who are going to be continuing their conversation in their small group. What changes are necessary to live the energy ethics inspired by Laudato Si? What of your personal faith and values most connect with your commitment to these actions? How do you balance emphasis on lifestyle changes with group advocacy for scaling up social change? What are those reasons? And what impact would you like to have at what scale? What is your vision? So thank you so much for joining us, students, and we will continue. I have a few more questions here for you, Erin, from our non-college students. So we'll give about 60 seconds for the students to log off and go into their Zoom chat room. Looks like so these next 2 questions, Erin, are connected about us as Catholics and our role in the church. So one is about our family, our Catholic family and neighbors who unfortunately, and I think truth is so hard these days in so many arenas, right? But we know that one of the major issues that we see in our own church is that our friends and family are climate deniers. How would you suggest that we approach them?
Well, take a deep breath and approach them with as much compassion and curiosity as you can muster. Imagine that you are in a meditation session where you are curiously and compassionately observing what thoughts and feelings they bring to you. This is very, very hard, and I am not good at it.
Me neither.
I know it's what we need to do. We need to respect the views that people have because everyone has some truth. They have some truth that they know. And if you listen, you will find out what that truth is, and you can affirm it. And by coming to understand with compassion and curiosity what they may not know, you might be in a better position to share bridging points. Mm-hmm. An argument isn't going to work. An attempt to convince is not going to work. But listening, valuing, and then I think as much as possible, share solutions that appeal to their worldview. I very much believe that a big part of the reason some groups of people reject climate change has been they have not liked the proposed solutions. Their economic ideology, their political ideology reject solutions such as regulation, such as federal imposition. They just don't like regulation and federal imposition. Therefore, they don't like climate change. So we have to, that's fine. There's room for legitimate difference in our political and economic worldviews. But we can all get excited about solutions, and we can all celebrate the fact that Texas is the largest producer of wind power in the United States. And we can celebrate how many jobs wind power is bringing to Texas. So it's so important to talk about solutions and talk about clean energy and energy security and energy created at home and energy that doesn't give children asthma and energy that doesn't give pregnant women mercury poisoning affecting the neurodevelopment of their babies. So we need to emphasize our shared values and back up and talk about our faith as well. We have received this earth from God, our loving creator. We need to reverence it and care for it and not get into an argument between red states and blue states. We're Catholics who are gifted with this beautiful creation, and we are to care for it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, what you were saying, at Network, we have a workshop called Transformative Conversations to Bridge Divides. And, you know, the first thing I tell, well, maybe 10 minutes in, I tell participants about, right, if we are met with facts that go against our own worldview, it's a fight or flight.
Yeah.
Right. So I really, right, I get angry, I get belligerent, or I shut down because I literally can't be confronted by facts that go against my worldview. So I love what you were saying about solutions and shared values. That's where, yeah. So thank you for that. So would you say, this is a follow-up to that strand of thought, would you say that this is the same approach we need to be using with our bishops who have been many who have been silenced, or who have been silent about Laudato Si?
I wonder if with the bishops, the approach is to encourage them to see how much young people need us to care for them by caring for their home, this planet. The church is hemorrhaging young people, and the planet is likewise suffering. And if either the church or the planet is going to be a welcome and healthy home for young people, we need to work to make it so. And I think the bishops need to see this as evangelization. And, you know, the bishops haven't always done a good job of taking care of young people. And here's a place where it really needs to be done. And I think it's a great opportunity to do so.
Thank you. I just popped in a little shout out for our workshop, Transformative Conversations to Bridge Divides. If folks are interested, did have a little question about that. So going back to what I saw kind of as, you know, the thesis of your talk, a lot of people are expressing surprise and deep interest in this idea of fossil fuels as an act of war, as a weapon of violence. Can you expand on this just a little more, please?
Sure. This came to me pondering just war theory, which is an ancient and complex and well-regarded body of thought in Catholic teaching that has in fact been used by many within the church and outside the church to reflect on the ethics of war, you know, a situation which one could argue cannot possibly be construed as ethical in any way at all. But nonetheless, it's provided criteria for thinking about harm, reducing harm, protecting the innocent, proportionality in impacts. And so because it's such a dense and rich analytical framework, I was wondering, how might this analytical framework help us think about fossil fuels, which I really do believe are instruments of war against the earth and against ourselves. Yet what's so complex about it, we are the aggressor and the victim at the same time. We are complicit in this use of fossil fuels. And it's like original sin. We're born into these economic structures of our societies against our will, but they are the dominant methods. And unless you live 100% off the grid in a forest in a cabin, right, you're going to be using fossil fuels. How do we grapple with that? How do we attempt to move towards the pacifism of renewable energy? How do we disarm ourselves? And I think divestment is a necessary way. Choosing renewable energy in your utility is an even easier way, something most of us can do by calling up our energy company. And that's step number one. Do it tomorrow. Pull out your utility bill, call them up, shift to renewable energy in your electric system, and you will be increasing demand for renewable energy, and you will be shifting the patterns of supply in your region. But it was primarily this desire for an analytical framework to help us look at harm and make sure that we're counting all of the harm, because the victims of fossil fuels are many, and our economic system hasn't counted that. It's just said, okay, gas is $3.29 or $2.79, and that's the cost. No, the cost is much, much greater than that. And how do we think of it as an instrument of war with collateral damage?
Thanks. Kind of a follow-up. So in all these calculations, and I'm not sure if this is referring to the 1.5% or the 1.5 degrees Celsius, or just in terms of this of usage. Does it include military usage, the US military? Or does, sorry, this question, I'm trying to figure out what this question is trying to get at here. But it is a good, I think, just is the military being considered in our nation's use of fossil fuels?
Well, they certainly are large consumers of fossil fuels, and we all know war causes a great environmental cost, aside from its use of fossil fuels, just in its destruction of ecosystems and release of toxins and so on and so forth, not to mention sheer death. But it's actually interesting that the military, in a completely different direction, are very good allies in arguments for climate change mitigation, because they have a very clear-eyed sense of what's a threat, and they know that climate change is a threat. So you won't get military people denying that. They know it's a threat. And the other interesting fact is that the organization globally that owns the most real estate with coastline, and that means coastline that's sinking, is the US Navy.
Of course. So it really is in their self-interest to advocate with us. Yes, okay, wonderful. Well, that's complicated and interesting. I think we have about 5 minutes left. If there are any other questions this evening. Doesn't seem so. So David, if you would like to close us out here, I think we're ready.
Thank you, Meg. It's been
You're welcome.
with you.
Hello, hi, thank you so much, Erin and Meg, for this wonderful session tonight. I learned so much, and I asked the couple of people that I'm watching it with, do you have questions you want to send in? And they both said, No, I'm just sitting here absorbing and learning so much that I'm not coming up with any questions at the moment. So really want to thank you again. It was wonderful. And I want to just remind everybody, next week we have Martha Hennessy will be our speaker, and she will be talking about Dorothy Day and her vision of nonviolence. Of course, Martha is Dorothy Day's granddaughter. And so we want to invite everybody to return next week. And again, I want to thank Erin for stepping in, doing a wonderful job, and Meg for moderating and the question and answer, and for bringing in the introduction. The opening prayer was wonderful. And again, thank you and good night.